Hey, everybody, welcome back to another Contest Prep University Peak Intel Science Series episode. We're going to cover a tiny little topic called hormones. Austin, obviously, it's what everybody seems to love to chat about in our world. And I want to start with some of the physiology, and my intent is to really winnow this down to something that's so easy to understand that instead of us doing 10 episodes on this, we can really encapsulate it into one and just show people in our world what I think they want to hear, which is, of course, fat loss and muscle gain, right? Or at least muscle retention. So really briefly, and I'll let you have a swing at this as well, because as a registered dietitian, I'm sure you're very familiar with all the ins and outs of hormones, but hormones really encapsulate the entire endocrine system. That's what the endocrine system is. So chemical messengers between glands and tissues and cells, all with the goal of homeostasis, trying to maintain the kind of balance we need in our body for a myriad of functions, from sex to mood to just immune system and so forth. A lot of classifications are out there with hormones, and this is where it can get a little murky. But I'm gonna take the really simple road. So of the 50 or so hormones, a lot of people would classify those per their chemical structure. So are they lipid derived, protein derived, peptide derived? I remember in my first book 20 some years ago making a big deal about testosterone being a cholesterol derived hormone. That was just a big thing back then, trying to emphasize the role of fat in diet. I kind of wish I hadn't gone there because I probably overemphasized it, but 20 years of more nuanced research and contextualization have helped. But you can also divide those categories, down to individual hormones like androgens, estrogens, cortisol, growth hormone, et cetera. But again, I want to keep this simple from my perspective and say, here are hormones that are going to primarily deal with fat loss and then muscle gain or muscle preservation. All of the other health aspects we're probably just going to maybe mention, but really not focus on. But with that as a little bit of a tee up for you, anything that you want to say about the entire topic in general?
No, I think you touched everything pretty well. I mean, just to kind of add on to it, I think this topic, as we spoke just before we started, you know, it's a pretty deep topic. You made kind of a joke. It's a small subject, but as I think some people don't realize, like when we talk about dietary fat in relation to how it can be effective or how it affects, our hormone function, it is a very deep topic. So I'm excited to jump into it and hopefully kind of explain things, because there seems to be a lot of things in the coaching industry and the fitness industry of everybody and their dog now has something that they can do to fix people's hormones. So I hope that we can kind of take a step back and explain hormones a little bit for people today, and then explain outcomes of, muscle maintenance and fat loss and how that affects hormones, like you had mentioned, and what, you know, it really means to make sure that we are paying attention to our hormone health in ways that we can, truly optimize it, not just saying that we have a 30-day quick fix to hormones. So I brought a lot of notes, as I know you did as well, because I don't want to leave out the things that we're going to talk about today. So I'm just excited to jump into it.
Yeah, and to your point about it being a topic very well addressed in our industry, mostly, of course, by people who have no idea what they're talking about. A little preface that I would throw in here: I'm not a physician. You're not a physician. You're a registered dietitian. I have a doctorate in health education, another in nutrition. We're coming at this from an academic perspective, but we both have allied health degrees and backgrounds. So I think that should give somebody a little bit more trust in what we're willing to say and not say, because I think you're exactly right. If coaches out there say, hey, come to me, I can fix your hormones, you should probably stay away from that coach, unless they are a physician or endocrinologist. So let's go with what I think the heavy hitter could be in most people's minds, which is fat loss. Everybody's worried about their metabolism tanking. Everybody's worried about maybe even androgens, testosterone dropping off a cliff. And so they start losing muscle. So how you even start to diet or to prep for a contest in order to maximize your metabolic capacity, keep it as strong and healthy as possible, and preserve muscle, those are the pivot points for most people. So first, let me say, calorie intake is the biggest key, right? No matter how you decide to diet, low carb, low fat, etc., if you are trying to lose body fat in an extremely aggressive pace and you are dieting on sparse amounts of food, it's very equivalent in terms of your metabolic drop to how much food you're intaking. So just be wary of that. Perhaps you need a longer pre-contest. Maybe this is not the time for you to be dieting, et cetera. But I want to start with thyroid because a lot of attention is on that. What's it going to do to my T3, T4, TSH, et cetera. In one particular study that I've talked about for many years, is one that I think really shows the resilience of our bodies. So they took a group, a couple dozen women postmenopausal, and put them on a particular diet. They actually brought them into an inpatient ward, metabolic ward, and they baselined their individual metabolic rates, gave them an appropriate diet so they would all be in the same exact ranges of calorie deficit. And then they measured them in 4 different stages of this process to bring their BMI, down to a certain level. So the goal was to move from one BMI level to another. And these, again, were all women. They were even postmenopausal. So if you want to claim any kind of fragility within their endocrine system, I mean, that's certainly a big factor. And one of the primary things they measured was thyroid. And in the first 10 days, every single subject, I think maybe there was one outlier, but other than that, every single subject dropped about 6%. So their thyroid hormone dropped 6%. When they measured therefore their metabolic rates, their BMR, that correlated exactly to that 6% drop. So you could say, okay, that's stable. It's not 12%, it's not 50%, it's 6%. Well, then these women went on to lose an average of 45 pounds as the entire cohort mean. And it took them about an average of 5 months. So now you've got this entire cohort of women who have been dieting for 5 months. They've lost an average of about 45 pounds. And guess what their ending resting metabolic rate deficit in thyroid hormone deficit was? It was the exact same 6%. So it didn't keep cratering. It just stayed right there, stable dieting, but consistent, no diet breaks, things like that. Then brought back into the inpatient ward for the 4th 10-day stint. They put it back on metabolic carts and baseline them out again and saw, okay, what's it going to take in these 10 days to finish this study? We're going to gradually, which I put in air quotes because it's 10 days. And so after 5 months of dieting, we're going to take these 10 days to bring your food intake in this inpatient environment back up to where you metabolically should be for maintenance. Guess how long it took them to regain all 6% of their basal metabolic rate drop and their thyroid output? 10
I'm gonna
days.
say, what's that?
Oh, I gave it away. I said 10 days.
Ah.
Didn't take 2 months, didn't take 6 months, didn't take a year. Their metabolisms weren't damaged or wrecked. They literally saw a 6% drop in thyroid output in 10 days, dieted for 5 months, lost 45 pounds, metabolic rate and thyroid output came right back up that full 6%. So my point to that is anywhere between 5 to 15% of people have clinical or subclinical hypothyroidism. Most of those are people who are getting a little bit older, most of them also being women. And we tend to think it's my metabolism, that's why I can't lose weight. Well, in this key hormone group for weight loss, the thyroid hormones, that to me tells us it's just not really the biggest deal. I'm gonna let you jump in, comment on anything that you might have found with thyroid, but that's one group of hormones that I wanted to address today and just show people that as long as you're not doing anything that's just completely untoward in dieting pace, if you're not on a very low calorie diet, but just a good, appropriate, moderate level, then I don't think you have anything to worry about when it comes to thyroid.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when we're talking about like thyroid, like TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, um, I think people need to know that that is just one of the hormones. You also have T3, T4 as well. And um, it's interesting to hear that within 10 days that 6% kind of came back to baseline after such a drastic drop. It does make a little sense after some of the research that I have found as well. For example, one of the studies that I know I shared with you previously before the call was there was a military study at an Army Ranger school. Now, I will say with the caveat, most of these subjects were male that participated in this, but they looked at um, how was the endocrine and inflammatory markers of these individuals, how were they before and then during and then after an intense caloric energy deficit. So these individuals attended Ranger School where it was noted that there was high physical activity and a lot of calorie restriction. And the other one that I found interesting was sleep deprivation. And what they had found was there was about 23 individuals that ended up finishing, so not the biggest sample size, but they found that there was a decrease in testosterone, there was a decrease in IGF-1. Um, TSH actually increased a little bit, as well as sex hormone binding globulin increased a little bit. But what they wanted to look at was how long of a recovery period did these individuals have, you know, after this deficit, after this intense training that they went through. I should note that the intense training they went through was around 8 weeks. So it's not as much of a like a prep as we would say that might be 16, 20 weeks or what have you. But the fascinating thing was what they found was anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, these individuals had all of their markers returned to normal, but T3 was still low. And I believe testosterone came back to base. I'm just double checking my notes here. Yes. And so the reason I find that interesting is, as I had said earlier, T3 is part of the thyroid hormone. So that study showed that that was not back to normal just yet. However, the things that were noted with this, which is interesting, is that um, there was also a non-significant increase in cortisol throughout their training, and I found that to be interesting because people tend to talk about cortisol, which we'll get down the road here. And on top of that, the sleep deprivation I'm very intrigued by as well with this study because when we talk about people in prep, I'm sure you as well. I hear everyone preach, you got to make sure you're getting your sleep, getting your sleep. Well, this study kind of looked at that and they looked at these endocrine markers and these inflammatory markers. So even with a massive calorie restriction, high calorie output, excuse me, it took them about 2 to 6 weeks for all of their hormones minus T3 to return back to normal. So I found that very fascinating. And things that had changed was these individuals started eating more calories and they were not having as much. They were still being physically active, but they didn't have as much physically active output. So I say all of that because we can kind of compare that similarly to a prep, right? Cardio might be high, food might be low. People are working out 4, 5, 6 days a week. Um, Life and stress happens, so their sleep quality is not great, or they just aren't sleeping that much in general because they've got just so much going on in their life. Um, and then it seems like once we kind of adjust those things accordingly after an extreme deficit, we start to pull back cardio and we start to increase calories. We can see within a certain time frame these hormones coming back to normal. So I find that fascinating because in a way, the short duration, it seems, to return most of these hormones back to normal kind of lines up close to the study that you had mentioned. The T3 did not bounce back, and I had found another study, which I'll talk about later, that saw something similar. But I say all of this because I think people listening, like, it's okay sometimes that, like, when we're deep into a prep and we're maybe approaching a show, that it's all right. And there's a reason why we can pull back some cardio and increase more food. In some ways, it's going to be a big benefit to you. So I wanted to kind of add on to what you said and kind of give a slightly different context to it. I'll throw it back to you.
Yep, and I would tie those two together just in that context. So, in the study I looked at, we had, I believe it was 25, 26 overweight women who were past menopause. You were looking at people who were probably dieting a little bit more aggressively to a lower percent of body fat, which would represent a little bit more of the contest prep population. So I started off as a preface to my comment. The pace at which we decrease body fat is huge. Also, the level of which we settle. Like when you're looking at trying to get to 3% body fat or 5 or 6, 7, 8% if you're a female, that matters too. And people will have different reactions. Some people can diet perfectly well in terms of being balanced, moderate, sleep is great, everything is fine, and they still just don't have a homeostatic tolerance for being that lean. And you can see people who do have substantial decreases in T3, androgens, estrogen, et cetera, and have a more difficult time coming back up. So we'll come back to that a little bit, but that's a great direction toward just the status of both the diet and your anatomical state from a body composition perspective. One of the things that you mentioned too that brought up something important is fat loss and even adipose tissue is not a passive process. This is an important thing for people who maybe don't have a physiological background to understand. We tend to view body fat as just static amounts of energy stored in these body fat cells, but this is living tissue. Your adipose tissue that holds body fat cells, those adipocytes are part of that structure, but your fat collectively functions like an organ. It actually creates some of its own hormones, like leptin is produced in body fat cells. Cytokines, which ties into what you were talking about with inflammatory markers. So, a very important part of your entire health is tied to what's happening in those body fat structures collectively as an organ. So that was an important part of a meta-analysis that I looked at because they wanted to see exactly how body fat cells and that body fat system matrix is interacting with all of the hormones through an entire diet process. So I mentioned thyroid as a group that I'm interested in and kind of put off to one side. Another one that I think comes to mind for most people right away is going to be testosterone, maybe the other androgens plus the estrogen. So those lipid-based hormones that are for sex function and muscularity, growth, as well as catabolism. But then you also have things, you mentioned cortisol. That's another one, a glucocorticoid that's part of fat loss. It actually drives fat loss. You have the catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine. That's going to be, to me, that's going to be the hero of this whole podcast. But then even things like growth hormone and so forth, and all the other health-based ones that we're not going to really talk about. So let's turn to testosterone. I believe you said the study you looked at tested that to see how low it would go, and then maybe how long it bounced back. So what did you find with those androgens?
The interesting one in the military study, if I'm double checking my notes here, it was a pretty drastic drop. I believe it was like between 70 and 80% drop. Now, again, this is an extreme, they were in an 8-week thing, very extreme case. There was another study I looked at as well with, I'll just talk about it because I was going to bring it up later, but it's relevant now anyways. Another study I looked at, interesting enough, was out of Finland. This was a few years ago, I think 2017. And they looked at the effects of intensive weight reduction in female competitors, actual physique competitors. They had done a lot of controls with these females, diet, exercise. They used different measurements of like muscle mass to make sure that they were able to maintain muscle mass throughout this prep. I believe the average diet for these individuals was about 19, 20 weeks, 19.8, I believe, plus or minus a few weeks. Length of study was 22 weeks. And handful of female athletes that started, but at the end, I believe there was 27 females that completed. So again, not the biggest sample size here, but this is specifically what we're talking about, right? We're talking about physique athletes here. And they also saw a pretty massive decrease in testosterone. But the interesting thing, similar to the military study, is in the recovery period, they decreased physical activity they decreased their aerobic activity, I should say, their cardio, and they increased calories. Now, they looked a little bit further than 2 to 6 weeks or 10 days. They did follow-ups about 3 to 4 months post-recovery from this specific diet for these individuals getting ready for their shows. And they found free T3 did not return back to normal for some of the individuals, and testosterone did not as well. So it's very interesting. And then that one, again, looked more at females. The previous one looked at males. So I think there is some, asterisks that should be up there as far as the time frame for recovery for the men and their testosterone and the women and their testosterone in those given time periods. But both studies in calorie deficits with increased physical activity, especially cardio, decreased calories over an extended period of time, saw decreases in testosterone. Both groups saw a majority return within a few weeks, but some individuals did not. And, there's a few different reasons that could possibly explain that, depending on how lean somebody got, depending how far the calories were. Not everybody's calories were exactly matched, obviously, for specific needs. Sleep, stress, things like that can be, varied for individuals. But my point to answering your question is there was a very significant drop in testosterone in both studies. And these both looked at men and both looked at women in different settings. Most obviously relative to us is this physique study, but it was very interesting because they also tracked muscle. And they, their kind of ending to it was, when you're in a calorie deficit and you're maintaining, having little to no muscle loss, mostly from fat, they do see a decrease in some of these fat-derived hormones that we've been talking about, but anywhere from, I'm going to kind of round it, I'm not saying I'm going to kind of ballpark, anywhere from probably 8 to 12 weeks is probably where most people are returning back to normal for their hormones, but some might need 16, 20 weeks, and I don't know about you, Joe, we'll dive into this, but I've always kind of encouraged athletes that I work with when they diet for a specific period of time, I like to make sure that we're kind of reverse dieting for that amount of time as well, just to make sure that we are getting them back into a nice normal rhythm where their body composition is appropriate for them in the off season. And we know that their hormones have returned back to normal. So I'm throwing it back to you. I did see a significant decrease in testosterone for these individuals, but most of them were able to recover within a specific time period.
Mhm. And let's stop for a timeout just for all of us here to make sure that we annotate that this is significantly important in that these drops in thyroid hormone, testosterone, et cetera, they are initially rapid, but they're not necessarily devastating for some people. And let me explain that. In the thyroid study, 6% drop, stayed at 6%, immediately came right back up 5 months later. In that context, in women who didn't quite get as lean, they weren't dieting quite as hard. So that's one salient point showing that if you were staying above the metabolic fray, if you were staying above your metabolic set point, you're probably safer. As I said, when we get super, super lean, and then you put in a group of people who just may genetically not do well with dieting, getting down to that level of body fat is a serious injury to your body. Your genetics, your epigenetics are going to change because of that. You have induced a willful starvation in your body. And the book has nothing to do with this. It's psychological trauma. The Body Keeps the Score. I think that's the most brilliant book title I've ever heard. The Body Keeps the Score. Once you do something like that, you've gotten down to 3%, you've dieted for 6 months, your body may never be the same because you are now epigenetically setting your body up to want to be able to survive catastrophic calorie deficits, famine, so to speak. So you have to realize that is the challenge and the risk of dieting to this extent. Again, not many people get to that extreme where it's clinically significant and they have done something where they're going to be on some medication forever. But you may find your testosterone levels never come back up to where they were. Your T3 may never come back up to where it was, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a deficit that stays with you forever. It's just never going to be quite as high again because of that. So I think that takes some digesting for people, that this is not always a perfectly safe endeavor. Go ahead. Looks like you want to
No,
say something.
I was going to say, I agree. And I think the other thing too that the viewers or the listeners need to understand is you and I are talking realistically short term. Like we're talking like our studies right now are relatively short term diets. Most people listening, when they're getting ready for competitions, they do more than one show and some diet for more than 16, 20 weeks. Some might do 2 shows and they spend 6 months getting ready for those 2 shows. They shut it down for maybe 3 or 4 months and they start prep again the next following season. And they kind of just run into that cycle, right? Of it's like they're not really getting enough time to um, get their hormones back up. Maybe they are, because some of the studies we've talked about, 10 days, 12 weeks, whatever. Um, but again, each individual is different. Like you said, the body keeps a score that just might not be back up fully for all hormones, and they jump back into a longer prep, and it's just kind of that cycle. So, that is something that individuals have to consider as well. It's a risk reward. And so I think it's important that people need to pay attention to some of these things in their off season, because if something doesn't feel like it's going well or going right for them, um, it's important to get that looked at. Again, most people seem to bounce back okay, but there are going to be individuals that listening here that are just questioning, something just doesn't feel right. Something's off. I'm just struggling to lose more body fat than I was before. I'm doing more cardio, eating less food. It's just not happening. What's going on? And this is kind of some of the stuff I think that we're trying to get through to people, because it is a hard pill to swallow, some of the things that we're covering.
And you're going to survive. I mean, we have 2 to 3 billion years of multicellular organism evolution. Even if your hormone levels are sub where they were prior, that's normal. That's what evolution designed us for, is to withstand famine. So let's a little summarizing so far. So thyroid hormones, the androgens, testosterone. We're looking at one of the key components of the ability to lose weight with thyroid. Hormones like testosterone to preserve muscle, gain muscle. Again, all dependent on calorie intake, the amount of calorie deficit, as well as your status when it comes to body fat, body composition. So what's the answer to make sure that those rebound properly? You reverse diet appropriately. You bring calories back up. You get, whether you call it a reverse dieting or recovery dieting, however you want to differentiate, you just have to gradually bring your calories back up to where you have a maintenance level and your body composition is approaching or elevating above your metabolic set point. And that's all it is. Quote, fixing your hormones is just that. You just have to get out of that calorie deficit long enough. But one of the groups of hormones I failed to mention so far are the more dietary ones, like the interplay between glucagon and insulin. Those are also what people tend to talk about when they're in prep, or it used to be when the insulin model of weight loss was kind of dominant. And I just want to briefly mention these because it is a factor. Insulin is a hormone that helps you store body fat, but also helps you build muscle. And so that's going to decrease sharply and significantly, and you need it to lose body fat, because you need to be in an energy retrieval mode. Glucagon is going to be more dominant. But again, how do you preserve muscle from those dietary hormones? Don't go on a ketogenic diet. You've got to keep enough carbohydrates in there to keep some insulin sensitivity high and flowing the insulin at a normal rate. So again, I'm not going to talk a lot about that, except that we have plenty of research and podcasts that deal with just fat loss in general. But that is another group of peptides and hormones that I think we need to really understand are part of the process.
Yeah, I would agree. Glucagon, excuse me, doesn't get enough discussion, but I mean it plays a big factor when we are in a calorie deficit. Other people also may ask, like, how come we consume more protein during a prep and less protein in an off season? Well, because part of that is, when we get really low body fat and we're not getting enough calories in, our body can jump into a mode such as gluconeogenesis. So it is going to try to use glucose from, non-glucose based things such as amino acids. And so what does that mean? That means, our body may try to use amino acids from muscle tissue to get a glucose response that we need. So we do need to make sure that we're consuming, more protein to try to spare that muscle tissue, especially when we are pulling back carbohydrates and we are pulling back so much that we're getting to such low stores of body fat. Our body needs to think, blink, breathe, and run its process. So it's got to get that energy from somewhere, right? And when we have such low body fat, it's going to jump to other stores. So it is another thing that, I think probably most experienced competitors have maybe been explained that before, but maybe not. And I think some of the newer competitors listening, that's kind of a reason why we've got to make sure that we're still eating some carbohydrates, like you had mentioned. And that's another reason why there are some research studies that show that we can have a little bit of a higher protein intake in a calorie deficit to help at least maintain our lean muscle tissue.
Keeping some carbs in your diet for that reason, to decrease cortisol, keep insulin at least surging. It's almost like a mini diet break. Instead of a mesocycle where you may say, okay, I'm dieting for 6 months, I'm going to take these 2 or 3, 1 or 2 week diet breaks. Every single meal that you may not have carbs every single meal of the day, but every time you do have some carbohydrate, it's like a tiny little micro diet break for your body to just breathe almost a sigh of relief that, okay, I have enough energy. I don't have to, maintain the starvation mode threat level. And that's when cortisol will come down a little bit. Insulin is not going to go out of control and cause you to store body fat, but it's going to tilt your homeostatic balances toward anabolism and get out of that much in that severe of a catabolic state. So things like human growth hormone, cortisol, I kind of lump them into that insulin and glucagon grouping of hormones, which ironically are all driven by leptin. So when I said that adipose tissue is an active player, it's literally driving the process. Think of it like an organ system. Leptin is central to all of this. Leptin is communicating with all of these groups and categories of hormones and driving information back and forth to the hypothalamus in your brain, which therefore controls hunger cues and satiety and things like that. So when we're talking about fat loss, as I describe it to clients sometimes who are maybe just struggling a little bit with the whole process, the day-to-day, 24-hour-a-day consistency, I like to bring them back to almost the 80s and 90s style of dieting, when people like Bill Phillips were really big on eat, 6 times a day, every 3 hours. We've taken a turn so far toward intermittent fasting and spending enough time between meals without food to create more lipolysis, which is totally something I agree with. Like there's a time and a place for that, even in every single day. But sometimes you just have to make it to the next meal. You're in a calorie deficit for a long amount of time. And so you just have to know I can make it for these next 2 hours, this next 30 minutes, this next 3 hours before my next meal. And some of that is making sure you have enough of the right balance of protein, carbs, and fat so that things like leptin, insulin, glucagon are signaling with your hypothalamus to keep hunger cues normalized and at bay so you're not getting these massive, massive surges. So I think that deserved at least a mention when we're talking about hormones, is that's kind of the central part of the wheel. Everything else is a spoke off of that. But I do want to get to what I said was going to be the superstar, the hero of this particular talk. And it is the group of hormones called catecholamines, or adrenaline-based hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are activity, exercise, energy expenditure-based hormones. So every time you move, you potentially activate those hormones to be released. And their job is to liberate energy in your body to support the movement. I always like to give an example like this. Here I am sitting at a conference table in front of a camera. What if all of a sudden I had to get up and run out of my building? Boom, a big surge of these adrenaline-based hormones, and all of a sudden my liver is dumping glycogen, glucose into the bloodstream. Body fat cells are just flooding the bloodstream with fatty acids so the liver can turn them into glucose. And all of this stuff because my body doesn't know when that energy demand is going to stop. It was just stressed. We do that with exercise. We do that with psychological, literal anxiety and stress. And those hormones are profound. These researchers in this meta-analysis, when they looked at all of the categories we're discussing here, the dietary ones, insulin, glucagon, et cetera, the androgens and estrogens, the thyroid hormones, et cetera, you throw all of those together, all of them together, add them up, and they do not even come close to a fraction of importance in weight loss as these hormones. When you have intense exercise, for example, one study tested people at max threshold exercise. So something like Wingate sprints. And they were able to show a 1,000 to 1,600% increase in epinephrine and norepinephrine, 1,000 fold increase in growth hormone, human growth hormone. These are the hormones that, again, can maximally drive fat loss if you're then going to, use them in that exercise bout. So here's the irony. Maybe 10 years ago, everybody was big on HIIT, right? High intensity interval training, because of some of this kind of research. And then everybody realized, well, gosh, that's kind of like a leg workout. I'm trying to train my glutes 3 to 5 times a week. I'm quads a couple times a week, hamstrings. I'm in a calorie deficit. I'm not getting enough sleep. And now you want me to do that every day? No, you don't do it every day. But if you want to keep some of it in your managing recovery, these two particular hormones are absolutely the biggest drivers of fat loss. So, again, management is key for recovery and staying injury free. But if we're going to talk about hormones, we cannot leave them out when it comes to fat loss.
Yeah, such an important factor. I still every once in a while hear the debate for HIIT cardio versus like the steady state cardio. So it is a good mention, and I think those are hormones that should be brought up. And again, I know we've talked about this in length. I mean, I think the biggest factor that we've kind of repeated over and over again is stress. We've talked about sleep a couple of times. Like those things still need to be taken care of in order for all of these things to work really, really well. Which again, I mean, there are some variances to that. Going back to that military study, that's why I was kind of intrigued where they looked at sleep deprivation and saw a non-significant increase in cortisol. But we'll chat about cortisol here in a little while. Um, I think people need to understand that when they're getting to the stage, um, one thing we haven't really talked about too much is we want to make sure that we are still consuming enough dietary fat in our diet, and we're making sure that we're getting our sleep and recovery. We're making sure we're training hard. These things all need to be constant. The moment we kind of drop one of these little things, think of it like maybe like a tripod, then we kind of fall over. So we need to make sure that, and again, it's this age old thing where I just hear coaches like, I can fix your hormones. A lot of these coaches, what they're trying to do is just trying to get you to sleep more and not have as much stress. And then they sell you their supplement, and that supplement's probably giving you little significant difference compared to you fixing your diet, sleeping better, and managing your stress. I mean, that's really, and we're talking about studies that are showing that when you do these things, manage your stress and your sleep and, consuming enough adequate dietary fat, calories, and so forth, um, these hormones can work optimally. We just know that they take a dip when we start to decrease body fat, but the recovery period starts to show us that these hormones can bounce back within a significant time frame. So I'm just trying to put kind of everything together in what we've talked about. But I'll throw it back to you. Did you have another study that looked at something along the lines of what we're discussing, or what did you kind of see with some of these other studies?
Yeah, the thing that I would bring back to mind is that, as you said, most of these hormones do have that acute drop, stabilization, and then recovery. And even if they don't recover completely back up to your non-dieted state, a lot of that is because most people in the sport generally stay a little bit leaner. Not everybody, but I do know an awful lot of people. A client of mine comes to mind who lost 40 pounds for a contest, her first contest. And then, she never got above 10, 12 pounds over that. That's just her new life. And what I do want to talk about exactly how to, as you said, make sure you don't need those idiotic coaches who would claim that they can fix your hormones just by how you manage your diet. But there are studies even that counter what we're describing. And again, it's context, but like, Bill Kramer, who did an awful lot of exercise science pioneering research in the 70s and 80s, he showed that, some people who start to diet and exercise, their testosterone levels actually increase because that anabolic response to better nutrition, even though it was in a calorie deficit, and to weight training stimuli, that improved it. I think all of our viewers and listeners are going to already be there. So they're kind of maxed out at that level of how much input they're getting from those sources in terms of stimulus to their body. So, my point is you're going to remedy a lot of these issues just by training hard, but giving yourself enough time to recover. And then as we keep talking about sleep and so forth. But I do want to say that One of the things that I saw in terms of the difference between super lean people and people who would not necessarily get quite as lean, but diet down to that level, their hormone levels would shift downward as well. And then often they did not have those troubled, rebounds. It is the person in our industry who just gets too lean or diets too hard. And I want to come back to make just a final point before we talk about the dietary ways to make sure we mitigate this. In that if you just don't diet too aggressively, if you feel like this is an incredible burden, you're starving to death, you feel like you can't control binging episodes, then you're just pushing too hard. And all of those are triggers, your homeostatic physiology saying, this is too far. I'm curious in your own personal dieting and then your work with clients, Austin, how many people just seem to be okay? Like, I can do this, year after year, diet after diet. And then there are people who just run their head into a brick wall and never learn that lesson.
Quite a few, I would say they struggle because I think there's the fear of missing out of being on stage. So I have a lot of people that are just like, I want to get to the stage, I want to get to the stage, but it's yeah, they're kind of ignoring some outside factors of, you're juggling like 12 things at once. You're not sleeping, you've had 2, 3 binge episodes because you're frustrated with X, Y, and Z. And to your point, it's like you're pushing yourself too hard, and I don't want to have people have like a scapegoat either. There's never going to be a perfect time for prepping for a show. Like if you want to do it and you're serious about it, do it. But you also need to have conversations with a client or yourself of, does this make sense? You have 3 weddings planned that you have to be at and they are out of state or out of country. Does it make sense to be dieting at this point? Are you the type of personality that can, weigh your food and get your workouts in and get your sleep and XYZ and doing these things? Or you just, lost a job and got a divorce? Do you think it makes sense to prep right now for a show, given the amount of stress you're going to be going through? So I think some of those things are worth mentioning because I think sometimes people jump into a prep thinking it's going to fix their problems, when in my coaching experience, it actually seems to increase their problems or develop new problems. For me, myself, maybe it's because I've been competing for a long time now. I've known how I can manage my stress and things that I need to do throughout my prep. But in the earlier days of prep, I mean, I did struggle. I was willing to go to lengths to get on. I mean, like it didn't matter if you want me just to eat fish and green beans, even for breakfast and everything. Like I'll do whatever. I just have whatever it takes. Now it's like, well, willing to do whatever it takes, but with education. And I think that's where more people need to be, is like, we need to have that hard mindset because this is a competitive sport. We all want to win. We want to do well, and you want to get after it. Absolutely. Do whatever it takes in that regard, but do whatever it takes to where you're also setting yourself up for overall health. If you are having binge episodes or you're not sleeping and you've got a lot of personal things going on that are just not, allowing you to focus on prep, that's okay. Bodybuilding shows aren't going anywhere. You got to fix those other issues first. Because again, getting ready for a show is not going to fix your problems. If anything, again, in my experience, I've seen it create more problems, from a social standpoint, from a physical standpoint. Um, that's where people have to just be careful. It can be safe to prep, but both your mental health and your physical have to be there throughout the prep. So that's kind of been my experience from myself and a coach's experience.
And here's another one of those looks into the long-term effects of dieting. One particular study addressing this specifically wanted to see how far does your resting metabolic rate come down, and then does it recover? And they saw that for most people, depending on your sex and the amount of weight you're losing, your resting metabolic rate may come down about 300 calories a day at most. And an average was closer to about 200, 225. And these subjects lost weight, everything's great. Then when they came back up to maintenance levels of food, and even looking at, I believe, 6 and 12 month check-ins afterwards, the average actually were still about 150 calories under where they started. So that's maybe 5%. The price of admission, the price to get that lean and to create that injury state in your body where you have dieted yourself willfully to that famine level state, epigenetic changes of your body may linger to about that effect. And that was perfectly correlated with ghrelin and some other dietary peptides like PYY. So again, more hunger based, and what they call kind of the push away reflex of your food. Are you just feeling sated as this food is going in? Some of those being barometric receptors and so forth, baroreceptors. Um, but all that to say, there is a cost. You're not going to quote fix all of your hormones. Potentially, some people are going to be just fine. Some people will see some of these status changes, and they may never get worse. Again, the body keeps the score, not just for psychological trauma, but for this physiological trauma. But getting to your point about testosterone, fat intake, some of those dietary things we mentioned, carbohydrates are still important to keep in your diet. Never get into just a pure lifestyle of ketogenic dieting. But being cholesterol derived hormones like testosterone, which again, everybody thinks this is a big deal, keeping your testosterone up, you're going to see those drops. And as long as you're dieting, they're going to stay there. They're going to come back up mostly when you're done. But if you drop your fat intake lower than about 20% of calories from fat, you will see a diet-induced decrease of testosterone. Ironically, you get your calories above about 40% from fat, you also see a decrease in testosterone. So a very odd, in another space for me to use the word ironic, sweet spot is kind of 30% of your calories from fats. Now, I like to make room for carbs. So in a dieting state, I'm going to say 30% of your calories from fat is probably good for maintenance. I like to be down closer to 25, maybe a little bit even lower. But just consider that 20% kind of a minimum, 40%, you're probably getting too close to ketosis, ketogenic dieting. And that will actually cause diet-induced reductions of testosterone. So what can you do? Don't diet as aggressively as you may think. Give yourself more time. Start your diet a little bit leaner so you don't have to go through that harsh of a reduction with your T3, with your testosterone, et cetera. Give yourself the space so that you're not having to trip into super low insulin and cortisol levels. All of these help you not only preserve muscle, but preserve some of those hormone profiles and then make it easier to come back up and regain normal homeostasis. But we're getting close to our wind down time. Anything that we're leaving out here, Austin?
No, I'm glad you brought it. If we weren't going to get to it at the end, I was going to bring up. So I'm glad you talked about just the fat ranges, because uh, I think it's a common misconception with the cholesterol driven hormones where people are like, well, if I just eat a lot more meat and I increase my fats, and if I can increase my cholesterol, then I'll increase my testosterone. There are some misconceptions there. As you stated, if we get above 40%, we can actually see a decrease. It's also a misconception that dietary cholesterol does not necessarily affect our blood cholesterol. That is a misconception I did want to bring up. So, keeping things simple, 20 to 35% range is very good. I know you had mentioned 25. I kind of recommend in that similar range for people. 25% I think is a nice happy medium, and making sure we're consuming more monounsaturated fats can be beneficial. Some polyunsaturated fats are very beneficial as well, just as far as like what types of fats we should be eating. So I think that can be brought up. And then again, you had kind of mentioned not having to cut as much weight for the next time, setting yourself metabolically in a great position where your food has been relatively increased, your hormones are looking good, maybe you're, 12, 15 pounds over stage weight versus 30 or 40, you're not having to do as drastic, or maybe you're 8 to 10 pounds over and things are feeling good. I think all of those things need to be assessed post show, post time, and pre contest prep for that next season, making sure you're having all of these things in a row. Before you jump back into a prep, and when you're in that off season, to make sure that you're doing things appropriately. You're putting yourself in the best position possible for the growth season, the improvement season, whatever you want to call it, and you're putting yourself in the best position for the next time you decide to step on stage, versus just the show is done with, eat whatever I want, It's okay if I gain a little bit of body fat. I'm just going to strip it all off the next time. I still see people do this and kind of run into a bad food cycle. So that's just kind of some things that I wanted to recap and touch on before we ended.
Well, one more quick question for you. Um, do you know if drug-free organizations have banned GLP-1 agonists as supplements? That they are banned?
Yes, they are banned now. Yep.
Okay. So for anybody who is not competing in drug tested organizations, I will say also one of the catalysts for uh, keeping resting metabolic rates lower. So you've dieted, you've gotten way below your metabolic set point, you were as shredded as you need to be for a contest. One of the hormones also that does not often come back is GLP-1. So I don't know if you can yet, maybe if you're going to a compound pharmacy, if you can get doses even lower than the lowest dose of Ozempic, Wegovy, et cetera. But if I were dieting to extremely insane levels, and I was not competing in drug-free organizations, but I could use and was using PEDs of any sort, one of the tools at your disposal is to use not the weight loss recommended levels from companies making this, Novo Nordisk, Pfizer, et cetera. But man, just really, 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 really sub prescribed levels just to make sure those don't decrease. And that will probably help make sure your resting metabolic rate does not stay low if you're using that as a little bit of a tool. So my final summary here. Everybody, again, wants to think that estrogen and testosterone and those androgen-based hormones are just pivotal with dieting. They are the least impactful on weight loss. They just are. The catecholamines are highest, thyroid is second highest. Then you get into the dietary hormones like the GLP-1s, insulin, glucagon, all endogenously made in your body. And so your goal to keep all these things as elevated as possible is simply to make sure you are extremely consistent and sane and appropriate with your dieting. Don't diet on too low of calories. Give yourself plenty of time. Don't overdo it on the cardio and run yourself into the ground. Make sure you're scheduling everything appropriately. But all the way from just having enough protein that helps preserve lean body mass, have enough carbohydrates that can maintain insulin and therefore that anti-catabolic state in your body, again, thyroid hormones. I mean, maybe you're making sure you have enough iodine, potassium, calcium. Your parathyroid glands and extrathyroid are, controlling those things. Like there's a lot of little micro things you can do if you want to go that far into some internet research. But truly, the biggest levers are going to be just the pace and the depth that you get in terms of your genetic ability to withstand being that lean. So I don't know if that just sounds too esoteric, but hopefully we put that into some categorical buckets that you can understand. Anything as a final thought, Austin?
No, I think we've kind of covered everything. I mean, I think this might be a topic that we circle back on and maybe just do a few other little sub topics within this. Because again, as we talked about earlier, it's a beefy topic, and we barely even scratched the surface really of how deep things can go with hormones and body composition and things like that. So I think we achieved what we were setting out to today, and I'm hoping that people got some good points and will hopefully take those points and use them for their next off season or prep.
Yep, absolutely. In overview and our diet IQ episodes, things that we statically produce a couple times a week in our social media feeds are there. We also do Contest Prep University, of course, normal series and features. We're probably around 1,000 of those. Another thing people can take advantage of is our Contest Prep University D1 Club, where for $3 a month, you can be in this private group where Austin, myself, Adam Atkinson, our medical director, Dr. Souders, is there to facilitate all kinds of great discussions. You don't have to be a client of ours. You don't even have to have a coach. Matter of fact, a lot of coaches are part of our group because they want to learn some of these things. So wherever you are, if you want to be in a community that privately discusses these things, and even as a competitor, you can ask us specific questions. Here's what I'm doing. I've got a contest in a month or next week or this Saturday. Here are my photos. What do you guys think? It's just a place for us to share a lot of great support on a peer-to-peer level. So consider that. Just reach out to Austin or me to get information there. But we will see you guys next time in one of our deep dives in science research in our Peak Intel series. See you next time.